Now, let's take a look at how President Obama managed to avoid mentioning his successor. What was the main thrust of his discussion with students today?
Well, there's very much a history to this, Tabile. Former presidents, whether you're talking about George W. Bush before, they don't tend to talk about the incumbent while they are in office. They tend to sort of veer away from that. They take the higher ground, if you will. And I think that's in part what you're seeing here from President Obama, despite the fact that he's been mentioned by the incumbent many, many times, accusing him, of course, as well of wiretapping during the campaign, something former President Obama's spokesperson was then forced to issue a statement on rejecting that false accusation. But otherwise, we really haven't heard from former President Obama, who's been holidaying in French Polynesia, writing his memoirs. Of course, emerging today, and very much a focus here on the youth. And I think what this president is now this former president is most concerned with, Tabile, is a tendency in youth in the United States to be very sort of apathetic towards politicians, towards the political process in this country. And former President Obama very, very specifically mentioning certain areas, things like gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is essentially a process of redistricting that happens at the state level. And Republicans currently, and for a very long time, have had a majority of states under their control. What they are then empowered to do is to draw the lines for different districts. And what they have done over time is to draw lines that favor one political party over another. So, for example, in one district, minorities would be excluded from a district so that they couldn't influence the vote outcome in terms of electing members of Congress. And this is why it's very difficult for Democrats to take control of the House of Representatives, because of the redistricting that happens at the state level. So he's really trying to educate the youth about how the political game actually works in this country. Things like money in politics. Hillary Clinton had to raise $1 billion just for her 2-year presidential campaign. Similar figures you see from other candidates over the years. If you look at the French election, you just did a story on that. If you look at what's happening in the United Kingdom, there's a very short election period in those countries and a very limited amount of money that will be spent. Not so in the United States. Voter apathy. In the United States, around 40% of eligible voters do not turn up to the polls to vote. So these are the things. This is the long game that former President Obama is looking at, so that he can ensure that Democrats actually then again can regain the three branches of government.
Sherwin, I just want to touch on what you said in terms of Obama wanting to educate the youth. I mean, is it fair to say it would be personal for him as he watches from the sidelines, as his legacy is being threatened somewhat by various actions by the Trump administration, most notably attempts to repeal and replace his signature healthcare legislation, the Obamacare, of course. Where does that process stand at this point in time?
I think what he's recognizing here is that the future of this country, as it is in many countries around the world, lies with the youth. But I also think there's a realization on his part that perhaps the youth have not been quite as engaged as they need to be. They don't understand the power that they have, and this is why he wants to get them back to the polls. Remember, it was the youth vote in 2008 that propelled this very unknown Senator Barack Obama from Chicago, Illinois, into the White House. It was that mobilization, that youth mobilization, that perhaps a Hillary Clinton and even a Donald Trump was not able to do as spectacularly as he did. On to the second part of your question, in terms of healthcare legislation, of course, you will remember that at the end of March, an attempt by the GOP in the House of Representatives, working in tandem with the White House, failed to get the required number of votes from within their own party to pass this legislation. So they withdrew the legislation. We are now hearing whisperings from the White House that there's another effort to revive this bill to replace Obama's signature healthcare legislation, but it's unclear exactly when this will move forward. And I think this speaks also to broader promises that campaigning Donald Trump made before he became president. Issues of building the wall. Of course, this wall is going to cost several $1 billion more than what anyone had estimated during the campaign. And so you're seeing President Trump now in a spending bill negotiation in Congress to lift the debt ceiling within a couple of weeks. He's trying to include part of a legislation into that bill that would fund this wall. Of course, Democrats are not having anything to do with that. In addition, if you look more broadly at his attempts at immigration, excluding certain people from certain countries where they have Muslim majority countries, 2 attempts at banning certain refugees or certain immigrants to the country have been blocked by federal courts in this country. So another failure for this president. So I think learning learning on the job, in part, Tabile, also a realization that you cannot just be a businessman when you want to run the United States government. You have to work with all the levers of government that are at your disposal.
Speaking of that businessman, now we're fast approaching President Trump's first 100 days in office this coming Saturday, with his polls numbers not looking good. What do the numbers tell us?
40%, 42%, last week it was 39%, and within the first 100 days there's always a sense that an incoming president will have a lot of goodwill, certainly within the first year of that presidency. This has not happened for President Donald Trump. You'll remember that on his inauguration day, January 20th this year, thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets across this country, around the world, in London, in Cape Town, in many parts in Australia, to protest the values that this president, they believe, represents. And so this has been an unpopular president from day one. But the interesting thing, the caveat here, is that 96% of the people that voted for Donald Trump, according to these polls, 96% Tabile say they would vote for him again. So he hasn't lost his base. He hasn't lost his core supporters. But I think what he is experiencing is perhaps those apathetic voters that sat on the sidelines, who perhaps don't quite like what they're seeing in this president. They are becoming active. You are seeing a grassroots movement across this country. Last week you had scientists march for science, essentially, because, he calls climate change a hoax, marching, wanting him to affirm the science out there. This coming weekend, on the 100 days, which is Saturday the 29th, hundreds of thousands will take to the streets across this country to protest in favor of climate change mitigation. So this is a president that, while he is in the White House, people have been on the streets.
Now, Sherwin, we also understand that the UN Security Council members are at the White House today. What exactly are they discussing?
Well, there's been a lot of concern, Tabile, about possible funding withdrawal from the United States. There's been rumors that they would cut 40% of their budget to the United Nations. Of course, the United States is the largest funder of the general fund of the UN. Some 22% of contributions come to that fund from the United States. And in terms of peacekeeping, they also contribute the largest amount of money, over $2 billion, about 28% of the peacekeeping budget. And so there's a great deal of concern, certainly within UN quarters, that this would really be very damaging. This would be very damaging to programs of the United Nations. It would be very damaging in terms of humanitarian relief and all that kind of stuff. So I get a sense that they're talking about that with President Trump. Of course, he wants one of his main foreign policy agenda items is dealing with the question of North Korea. We've also saw him weigh in on Syria. So I imagine all that sort of those kinds of issues are being discussed with Security Council members. And of course, I imagine the question of Russia's veto as it relates to Syria will be top of that agenda as well.
Now, Sherwin, just finally, politics aside, in terms of celebrations for Trump's 100 days in office, what can we expect?
Well, I heard he was doing a rally in Philadelphia, a place called Harrisburg, and I can assure you that he's probably going to get a great deal of his core supporters to turn out there. Of course, what's very interesting about the timing of that rally, it doesn't only coincide with his 100 days in office. As I mentioned, it coincides with these climate change marches that are going to be happening around the country. But also, I believe that night is the night that the White House Correspondents' Dinner is supposed to take place. Donald Trump, of course, informing the White House Correspondents' Association that he will not be there as the keynote speaker, as has happened with President Obama in the past, and before him his predecessor George W. Bush. It was always a tradition that the president would speak and crack a few jokes. So Donald Trump will not be at the White House that night. He will be in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, with some of his own supporters.
Sherwin, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. That was our U.S. correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, joining us to speak about those celebrations ahead of Trump's 100 days in office, as well as Obama's first public appearance since leaving office.